Welcome to my office here at Augustana College in Rock Island on a beautiful fall day. I get to look out and it's just a gorgeous day. I'm going to take this time on this gorgeous day to talk a little bit about the section on the confessions and the scriptures. It's not going to be sufficient, there's no doubt about it. I can't lay out kind of the entire historical realities of the 16th century that led to what the confessions ended up saying about scripture, but there are a couple things that I think would be helpful for you to know. In order to understand why certain themes are so consistent. The first theme that you're going to run into, and it's going to be unmistakable, is the idea that scriptures alone are the judge for all teachings of the church. That scripture is our form and our norm. I mean, it is the thing that we use to finally decide, what it is that we're going to say about God and the nature of God and God's relationship with us and all these sorts of things. Why is this important? Lots of things were happening in the 16th century. I'm not going to get into all of them, but for Luther especially, one of the most important issues was the claim, or at least what he perceived was a claim, that the Pope alone had the right to interpret Scripture. If you read the 1520 treatise to the Christian nobility of the German nation, in fact, this is with the second wall that he says needs to be torn down in order for the church to be kind of remade. And this notion that the Pope alone has the authority to interpret Scripture. So, in a way, what Luther's trying to say is that, Scripture kind of remains out there for all of us. And the Pope doesn't get to interpret it and then kind of add on to it if the Pope wishes to. Or this notion in the 16th century, amongst many medieval folks, was that the Scriptures were unclear and needed, the tools of philosophy and other sorts of things to kind of come up with some ideas about what God's doing in the world and how God's, for instance, like the Lord's Supper, the idea that there needs to be some sort of kind of philosophical underpinning in order to explain why it is that Scripture says what it says about, say, the sacrament of communion. Luther's having none of this. Scripture alone, it remains the authority and the judge, and that means that Scripture trumps the Pope. Scripture trumps philosophy. Scripture trumps reason. And the whole point to this, again, is to kind of, I think, to kind of point us to a source that we can all have access to. In the modern age, that might kind of seem ridiculous. So, don't use reason, don't interpret, and all. That's not what Luther was saying. What Luther was saying is that those things don't get to trump the Scriptures. So it's important to know that that's part of the historical reality. It's also important to recognize that for the Reformers, Scripture kind of exists in two parts. You'll see this in your reading, right? Scripture consists of law and it consists of gospel. And in some ways, and I think people rightfully sometimes criticize evangelicals, right, and Lutherans for being maybe too kind of oriented toward this law-gospel thing, but yet it's helpful. And it certainly was the 16th century reality that, the Bible is, according to them, right, it's the way in which God reveals law and God reveals gospel. The confessions speak of three uses of the law. There's the first use of the law is to outwardly, discipline wild and disobedient people, right? To kind of keep control over folks. That it actually operates as a law, like civil law, right? There's the second use, and that is it reveals to us our sin. It makes us acknowledge our sin, and it drives us to the cross. It's kind of the language that sometimes gets used, is that the law kills this idea in us that we are righteous. It shoves us to the doctrine of justification. It shoves us to the cross, and it shoves us to Jesus as our only means of salvation. So it reveals our sin. And then in the confessions, there's this idea also, this kind of this third use of the law, that after we become regenerated, after we have been justified by grace through faith, then people who are in fact Christians who are saved have some fixed rules according to which we can, direct our lives. So in these three kind of ideas that, that the Bible talks about these laws, this is how the confessions understand them, is that they work on these three different levels. And then that is, of course, then over against the gospel, which is the place in the Scripture where God makes promises to us. And for Lutherans, for Luther certainly, and for evangelicals, this is very Christocentric. This happens in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And anything, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that pushes this idea, according to them, this is gospel. This is the promise. So keep in mind things like, would the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, would that be law or gospel? Those are open questions. But this is how they understand Scripture, right? So as you're reading through your assignments, just keep these general things in mind. I don't know that you wouldn't have figured all that out on your own, but I wanted to at least provide you with a little bit of background. Hope I haven't been too rambling, but I just finished a gorgeous walk and my head is stuck in fall and trees, and I'm glad that my head is stuck there. And I hope that you're enjoying a beautiful day wherever you're at too. We'll see you on the forums.